There we go. There we go. Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Come on, it's not 8:30, it's 11. What time is it anyway? We're a little late, aren't we? Okay, how y'all doing on this fine Sunday? I know I must sound like a broken record, but I cannot believe how fast this weekend has flown by. Don't you agree? Are you all having a really good time? How many people have been to Contact before? Oh my gosh. And would you all agree that this might be the biggest one? I think so. So we're making a dent. We're doing something right. So, well, listen, the weekend has flown by, but the good news is that we are not done yet. There's much more to come, both today and tomorrow. And one more show of hands. Who's staying for the intensive for Monday? Okay. Come on. We need more people. Well, you're all settled in your seats, so that's a good thing, to get ready for David Childress. But before we get into that, I have to ask a question, and I know the answer. Is there anyone here in this audience who has not seen Ancient Aliens? I didn't think so. Well, for all of you who are fans of Ancient Aliens, you can't not know who David Childress is. He has and continues to be a most popular staple on this incredible series, now in its, I believe, 11th season. And though clearly Ancient Aliens helped to bring David's incredible knowledge and Indiana Jones-style curiosity to the forefront, that's only part of the story. This man is author of 20 books. I think he has all of them out there right now. 20 books. He's a world traveler and has done so several times over. And in some of his sojourns, he has ventured into dangerous territory, including Uganda, during the overthrow of Idi Amin. Did you know that? I think this man has adventure in his blood and in his oxygen supply, and probably came out of his mother's tummy with a big mission in mind, a big one. You'd have to do what he does, and to do so thoroughly, and to bring his findings to us on a regular basis. And today is no exception. That's exactly what he's going to do. David is going to enlighten us about the amazing and anomalous megaliths that exist around the world, those that have been studied, speculated about, and persisted in our ancient history for God knows how long. I am grateful to David and people like him who are courageous enough to dig deep, sometimes literally, to find out how these structures exist, how they got here, and most importantly, why they're here. But it's not just the megalithic structures here he'll be discussing. He's going to take you to the moon and show you what exists there as well. Again, the how of it all. How these structures got here, as well as on the moon, I think that's intriguing to a lot of us. Were they levitated into place? Was there a Tesla-like technology involved in placing them there? Are we talking about energy, frequency, and vibration, as Tesla was so famous in quoting when pondering the secrets of the universe? If anyone can get to the bottom of this, it's David Childress. And I guarantee what he finds, he's going to share with the world. And right now, he's going to share some amazing stuff with you. So without further ado, let's bring him on. David Childress.
Thank you. All right, thanks everybody. And so it's great to be here. This is some kind of great conference, huh? Yeah. I want to tell you a little bit about myself first, very briefly. I was born in France, actually, but my parents are Americans. And my parents loved to travel, and as a little kid, growing up early on in France, but later in Colorado, went to Mexico and Stonehenge and Brittany and France and to Greece and Turkey and places like that. Climbed the pyramids in Mexico, and I grew up in the 60s, so I got a strong dose of Johnny Quest cartoons and Lost in Space and Star Trek and the Time Tunnel and the Invaders. Remember that one? I graduated from high school actually in Missoula, Montana in the mid-70s, and then I had the opportunity to go to Taiwan as an English teacher. So I dropped out of the University of Montana and I headed to Japan and Taiwan, and my ultimate goal was to go to the Himalayas and climb. I was a technical climber at the time, so I wanted to go to Mount Everest and stuff like that. And I started traveling around the world. I wanted to see the Great Pyramid. I lived in Israel for a while. I went to Egypt. I went to Sudan. I got a job working with Chevron Oil, actually. So I worked with an oil company for a year or two in Africa and made some money. At the time, I was just sort of a $5 a day traveler, backpacker around the world. But like you, I've always been interested in UFOs, in Atlantis, and Bigfoot, psychic phenomenon, Tibetan mysticism, all that kind of stuff. And that's continued today. I eventually, when I returned to the United States in the early 1980s, I began writing my books. And so I also became very interested in anti-gravity, Nikola Tesla, all those things. So we'll get right into that. As far as Ancient Aliens goes, I was part of the original introductory documentary. And the show's been really going now for 12 years or so. It started at about the same time as The Big Bang Theory, which is a popular show. And that show's over now, but Ancient Aliens is still going. So now sometimes when I'm in airports particularly, somebody might come up to me and they'll say, "Aren't you on that Ancient Aliens show?" And I'll say, yeah, I'm on that show. And they'll say, "Can I ask you a question?" Yeah, I say, "Sure." And they almost always say, "What's with that guy's hair?" And Giorgio's a great guy. We've been friends from before Ancient Aliens, and I've known Eric von Däniken too. I also read Chariots of the Gods in 1972 when it first came out. My mom liked to read those kind of books, and so I read them too. And I have to admit that Eric's books really helped get me going. I would read his books, and I wanted to see him. He would go to these strange places and tunnels in Ecuador and all these cool places and Pacific Islands and stuff. And as a kid, I was like, hey, I gotta see this stuff, see it for myself. So let's get going here. One of the things that interests me so much is the super megaliths. Megaliths that are weighing 80 tons, 100 tons, 500 tons. That's a typical obelisk, weighs about 500 tons. The largest blocks that we know are in Baalbek, Lebanon. And according to mainstream archaeologists, they say that Baalbek was built by the Romans, but they can't figure out how they did it. And that's part of the problem with really building with megaliths that are, even something that's 20 tons is really extremely heavy. So when you get to 100 tons, 200 tons, 1,650 tons. And this megalith is the largest now. They've only just recently discovered it because it was buried in the quarry there. But how are you going to lift these things? Why are you even trying to build with such giant blocks of stone? And the answer can't be that, oh, you just want to do things in the most difficult way that you can. The answer really has to be that you are building with these giant blocks of stone because it's easy for you. You have the ability to levitate stones, to have anti-gravity. So to build a giant hotel like this, instead of building it out of bricks or cinder blocks or something, if you could build it all out of giant 1,000-ton blocks of granite, that would be the easier way to do it. What's at Baalbek really is a platform of giant blocks that has a Roman temple built on top of it, really. And the earlier super megaliths are pre-Roman, obviously, and we don't know how old they are, many, many thousands of years old. We have the same thing at Jerusalem, and that is what we're looking at right here. This is a block that's in a tunnel at the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, and King Solomon's temple was built on top of this. So the temple at Jerusalem is a lot like Baalbek in the sense that there's an earlier super megalithic platform there. Today, the Al-Aqsa Mosque is also built on top of Solomon's temple. So we have 3 layers of construction with the super megalithic construction of this giant block here. The woman is standing there. There's smaller blocks here. They're perfectly fitted together. You couldn't see this stone until about 15 years ago because the Israelis had to empty a tunnel that went along one side to the left side of what they call the Wailing Wall. And that uncovered this stone. And we don't know how large this stone is because we don't know how deep it goes. It too can be, say, 1,000 tons or something. But you have these other perfectly cut blocks underneath it. They're also megalithic as well. So we have all this ancient kind of construction that has other construction on top of it. And even there's megalithic construction on top of megalithic construction in many ways. There's over 200 known sunken cities in the Mediterranean, and they weren't built underwater. And in fact, just recently, they discovered just off Sicily what appears to be a fallen obelisk. It's underwater. They discovered this about 6 years ago, and it's in about 100 feet of water. It was standing up on dry land at one point, but there's evidence here that the Mediterranean was hit by a giant tidal wave, probably about 10,000 BC or so, and it filled in the Mediterranean, and it turned places like Malta and Sicily and many of the islands, it turned them into islands, and all these cities became underwater. What we're looking at here is an aerial photo of the unfinished obelisk in Egypt, in Aswan. It too weighs nearly 1,000 tons. Most obelisks weigh about 500 tons or so. And an obelisk is a monolithic stone. It's one piece of stone. Typically, obelisks are made out of red granite, Aswan granite, if it's an Egyptian obelisk. What happened with the unfinished obelisk was whoever was quarrying it, I think pre-Egyptians were doing it, and as they were excavating the obelisk here, as they began cutting underneath it here, underneath this obelisk, they discovered that there was a natural flaw in the stone, and they hadn't seen it before. They couldn't see it until they started cutting underneath the obelisk, and there was a crack. So the obelisk wasn't going to be perfect, and they stopped the quarrying right then, because the obelisk had to be perfect. It couldn't have any cracks in it to be used for what they wanted it to be used for. So we'll get into that more later. My newest book is this book here, Obelisks, Towers of Power. It's at the printer right now, so I don't have copies, but I'll have them in just a week or two. And in this book, I talk about obelisks, I talk about Tesla, and I talk about obelisks on the moon and elsewhere, and we'll get into that later in the program today. I've always been interested in Atlantis, in Mu, and ancient civilizations. I lived in India, Nepal for some years, very familiar with the stories of the Rama Empire and the Mahabharata, of the Manas. So these ancient civilizations are fascinating to me. I'm a believer in extraterrestrials. I'm a believer in Atlantis, and that advanced human civilization too goes back many tens of thousands of years. Cro-Magnon man, whom we're descended from, was taller than we are, and he had larger brain than we are too. We as Homo sapiens we've been getting smaller throughout history, really, not taller. In the last 100 years or so, people have been getting taller, mainly through better nutrition and stuff like that. But basically, physically, humans have been getting smaller. So the story of Atlantis is one that's always intrigued me. And as a kid, I went to Santorini in Greece. And some people have said, oh, this is Atlantis. Part of the problems with Atlantis is that Atlantis was an island and there was a cataclysm and a catastrophe. So archaeologists are like, oh, well, let's go find an island and let's find a catastrophe. Well, that's pretty easy. You don't have to go very far right there in the Aegean to find an island and a catastrophe. Atlantis has been placed all over the world, in Indonesia, in the Sahara Desert, in the Azores. It's been placed in the United States, in Cuba and Mexico and Antarctica even. And the story of Atlantis, just briefly, it's an Egyptian story. It's the Greek philosopher Plato talks about Atlantis in two of his dialogues. And in his dialogues, he says that his uncle, who was a Greek statesman named Solon, went to Egypt, and he was told by priests in Egypt that the priest told him, they said, you Greeks don't even know your own history. Greece is a much older country than you even know. And he tells them, the Egyptian priest tells Solon the story of Atlantis, and that even Greece and Atlantis fought a war. So we have other stories too and this has been coming out of India just recently, of the Tamils there saying that, oh yeah, the ancient Indian, the Tamil nation was much bigger. We had a lost land that went through southern India and even went to Australia. So, and then we have the lost continent of Mu out in the Pacific and whatnot. And all these would have been megalithic cultures, people who had the ability to move, cut giant stones, and that's what they wanted to do. So let's go briefly to South America and look at some of the stones. Perfectly cut, giant blocks of granite. This is Ollantaytambo. It's between Cusco and Machu Picchu. And it's one of my favorite sites. When you look at Ollantaytambo, you see these giant blocks, 100-ton, 200-ton blocks of red andesite granite. And what we're seeing here is exactly how it was during the Inca times too. So when the Incas and the Spanish actually fought a battle at Ollantaytambo, but this is what it looked like even then at the time of the conquest. And the Incas themselves weren't capable of moving these giant blocks. So what we see today at Ollantaytambo is exactly how it was in Inca times too. A bunch of scattered giant blocks that were meant to be part of some giant structure that was either destroyed or it wasn't really completed. And something that I talk about in many of my books is this, and it's called a keystone cut. So a keystone cut is a T-shaped cut or an hourglass cut. Sometimes they're also circular, and they're always on two sides of giant blocks. So there's always got to be another one of these corresponding, and then molten metals are poured into this. But there's a problem at Ollantaytambo because you can see places where these keystone cuts are on vertical walls, like what we're seeing here. And that means that this block is not where it's supposed to be. This block has been moved, whatever it was supposed to be, and another block, it was somewhere else, because you wouldn't have a keystone cut on a vertical wall like that. At Ollantaytambo, as you walk up into the main part of the structure, you see these perfectly fitted granite walls and things. You have huge lichen patches. You have those knobs. It's megalithic. It's incredible. The quarry is on a mountain across a river, so just bringing the blocks there was a problem. This is Machu Picchu, which I hope many of you have been to. It's a megalithic city too. It's a secret city on top of a mountain. Today, it's the most popular tourist spot in South America. Part of the whole thing in my books, and you know, Brian Forster's a friend of mine, his books are now kind of similar to mine. I first went to Peru in 1984. Now, as you go from Ollantaytambo and Cuzco and Sacsayhuaman, you go to the Altiplano and Lake Titicaca. So this is Lake Titicaca. Half of it is in Bolivia, half of it is in Peru, and it's the highest navigable lake in the world. Parts of Lake Titicaca are extremely deep. Up in this area, it's almost 1,000 feet deep. Other parts of Lake Titicaca down in the southern end are fairly shallow. There are sunken cities in Lake Titicaca. There are seahorses in Lake Titicaca, which biologists and geologists cannot explain. Seahorses are normally living in tropical Hawaii and Indonesia and stuff like that. They live in warm coral reefs and stuff. So why seahorses would be in Lake Titicaca is very strange. It would indicate that Lake Titicaca was at sea level at one point, and now it's nearly 13,000 feet in the Andes. There are underwater structures in Lake Titicaca, and in fact, recently, an Italian team claimed that they were diving, and it's difficult to scuba dive in Lake Titicaca. It's such a high altitude, you have to dive with mixed gases and things like that. But they claimed that they saw a golden obelisk underwater, just off of that northern part of the island of the sun. There's also a lot of UFOs come out of Lake Titicaca. We'll get into that in a little bit more. Recently, I was at this place, the Mocoyacta Chulpa in Espinar province. Not many people get to this. It's in a kind of remote area. It's megalithic. It's perfectly fitted together. We don't know what these were for. Mainstream archaeologists are saying, oh, these are burial towers. Although part of the problem was that, and even early Spanish noticed this. They said, well, if these are burial towers, they're perfectly fitted together. They're megalithic. But the people themselves are living in crummy little mud huts. And so they thought that was strange. They were like, yeah, the people live in these crummy mud huts, but they build these perfect megalithic towers for the dead. And they couldn't really explain that. So it baffled them why the Incas or these, what they thought were contemporary cultures, would be doing this. Well, part of the real answer there is that these towers aren't for the dead. They're not burials for the dead. But what they are smelters. They're for smelting metals. And they're furnaces, in a sense. So if you're going to have molten metals and you're going to have a giant metallurgical complex, you need smelting. And you need charcoal, you need to have furnaces, you have to have high temperatures to melt ores, you have to wash ores, you have to melt them, you have to mine them. So let's go real briefly to a place near Lake Titicaca called Coquimbo. You have to climb up on top of a mesa to go to Coquimbo. And when you get up there, there's a bunch of towers, and also square buildings too. They're megalithic, they're perfectly fitted together. They're partially destroyed. They too are smelters. And if you look here, you will see snakes are in relief, and sometimes pumas, and sometimes lizards on some of the blocks. So here we can see one here, it's a snake. You see this also in Cuzco. There's certain places, they're not everywhere, but suddenly one stone here or there will have a snake on it. And there's another place also, this is all near Puno on the Peruvian side of Lake Titicaca. This is a place right near Silustani. It's a lake called Lake Amayu. It too is noted for UFOs to come out of the lake late at night at about 4 in the morning. There's another lake near Cuzco that's famous for this too. And I've stopped at both these places and I've talked to locals. I've not seen the UFOs myself because you would have to like camp out there all night and then hopefully at 4 in the morning you would see this, basically a flying saucer or something, come up out of the lake. So this lake has these stories of the UFOs too. There are towers there too, and also giant square buildings. They're megalithic. And they also have, some of them, have these snakes, these snake stones that are on them. So this is a common symbol that we see throughout Peru and also in Bolivia. Now what's interesting here is that if you go to northern Iraq, into the Kurdish area, where the Yazidis still live, and they are really the ancestors of the Sumerians and of the ancient Sumerian religion. And on their temples, they have these snakes that you see. This is from 1885. So these same snakes that we're seeing in Peru are on these temples in northern Iraq. Here's that same temple, the Lagash temple that today. So the snakes that we see in Peru are also seen on these, in a sense, Sumerian-type temples there in northern Iraq. We'll go to Tiwanaku here briefly and Pumapunku. Tiwanaku itself is another megalithic building. There's a structure, I mean, it's a whole complex. I claim in my books that it's a metallurgical complex. It's for washing ores. You have the Gate of the Sun here. This was erected in the late 1800s, and it's part of a bigger building. This is Viracocha here. He's got like a feathered headdress. He's carrying 2 staffs. And what's important here when you look at him, he's crying and he's got tears coming down his cheeks. And these are what they call the tears of the sun. And what the tears of the sun is gold. It's liquid metals. So what we see here with Viracocha is that Tiwanaku and Pumapunku, they're a metallurgical plant for processing ores, washing them, and the towers are for smelting. And what Tiwanaku produced was molten gold, molten copper, tin, bronze. And that's what a lot of the clamps were and things like that. Even in Cuzco, they said that the Sun Temple there the walls were covered in sheets of gold. And it was the same thing at Tiwanaku. Tiwanaku, the walls of the buildings there, they were wallpapered with gold. And in fact, some people say that the story of Jason and the Golden Fleece is a story of Greek adventurers journeying to Tiwanaku. What's also interesting at the Gate of the Sun at Tiwanaku is that Viracocha figure is standing in the middle, but running toward him on either side are these birdmen that we see here. So these birdmen, and they're running toward him. And so they're the birdmen, the men who fly, and they have wings and bird heads. So they're the guys who can fly through the air. Here's another birdman. This one is from Costa Rica. He's an Olmec birdman. He has an elongated head. He's got the wings. He's jade. The Olmecs are thought of as being mainly in Mexico, but the Olmecs ultimately were all through Central America and even into Colombia, and ultimately were part of, I think, Tiwanaku and Pumapunku and building of Cuzco and Ollantaytambo and even Machu Picchu. This is Pumapunku. Pumapunku is partly massive sandstone slabs, but then it also has granite blocks, and it has these same keystone cuts that we were looking at before at Ollantaytambo. So here you can see some of the keystone cuts that are cut into these blocks. So you have megalithic blocks, and then the keystone cuts are cut in here, and molten metal clamps are poured into there. So you have to have molten metals just to do any of this. These are more of the keystone cut clamps on some of the giant sandstone slabs. In many cases, these blocks of stone are so huge, you wouldn't think that they would even need to use these metal clamps to somehow hold them together, but they did use them. And most of the metal clamps are gone because wandering tribes would come into these ruins, and that's what they would do. They would take those clamps, and then they would pound them into spearheads and swords and daggers and things like that. But we do have some of the clamps. They're bronze. So we're at Tiwanaku and Pumapunku and throughout Peru and Bolivia, we're seeing very sophisticated metallurgical processes of all metals. And in fact, they had alloys that we don't really use today, where they had so much gold that they were mixing gold into their alloys too. Gold is so soft that you need to mix it with some silver, copper, tin, bronze, trying to make a harder alloy. Gold makes it last long. Gold is indestructible. All gold of ancient times really still exists today. Most metals will oxidize and ultimately disappear, but not gold. This is one of these keystone cuts too, but it's in Vietnam. It's in the Kham cities there. And you still see these same keystone cuts in Angkor Wat in Cambodia. You find them in India. You'll find them in Turkey. You'll find them in Egypt as well. So these kind of keystone cuts that are in, and we're seeing them here too, they're all over the world, but this is an unusual way of fastening giant blocks together with these clamps and molten metals. So the idea that this would be developed separately in Peru and Bolivia and separately in Vietnam, separately in Indonesia or India and Egypt is quite unlikely. I mean, the same people who are building all these monuments, they're using this same technique, and it's an unusual one. This is an illustration from the museum in Tiwanaku showing some of the H blocks being put together. And here are these, the locals, very primitive here. So what we have is this, guy with a campfire, and they're wearing simple cotton robes and stuff. But what they're doing is putting in molten metals in these incredibly complicated, articulated H blocks and things. I mean, this is a very incongruous picture here, where we have like primitive Indians doing something that we can't even do today. So this is a scene that's quite inaccurate, really, because it's just a mixture of very low-tech stuff with extremely high-tech things. But unfortunately, this is how modern archaeologists and people think, because they're baffled by how just what they assume is a primitive society is doing things that are just so incredibly complicated. Now, one of the things that we have also right near Tiwanaku and Pumapunku, and it wasn't until a journey I made there about 10 years ago now, where one of the guides from La Paz, we were headed back from Tiwanaku back to La Paz, and he pointed to the west, and he pointed to this mountain, this hill over here. It's a pyramid. And he said to me, he said, yeah, that's a pyramid over there, and there's a village there. And the villagers are basically privately excavating this pyramid. And in other countries, you couldn't really do this, but Bolivia is one of these countries where, there's not a strong central government and a lot of restrictions. So people in this village are basically in control of this pyramid, and they're looting it in a sense. And what's come out of it, I wanted to go all the way to the village, and we had our bus and stuff, and he said, oh no, we can't go to this village. The villagers won't want us to come there because they're keeping it private. But this thing is huge, and it's a giant pyramid. It's artificial, but the Bolivian government has so far not recognized it. But here's what's interesting, is that near this pyramid in 1960, this bowl was found. It's called the Fuente Magna Bowl. It's a ceramic bowl. It was found in 1960 and by a guy who lived near that pyramid, and a local priest. He was feeding his pigs from this bowl. And the local priests noticed, he was visiting this man, and he saw this bowl and he thought, wow, this is an interesting bowl. Where did you get it? And he's like, well, I dug it up, here on my property. And the priest said, wow, this bowl should probably be in a museum or something like that. And they traded him a house for it. How about that? And they took it to La Paz. This was 1960. And they didn't put it in a museum or release it to the public until about 2005 or 6. And then they put it in this, today it's in the Gold Museum in La Paz. It's an official museum. And here's the thing, this bowl has 2 types of Sumerian writing on it. It has Sumerian cuneiform, which we can see here, and it has Sumerian hieroglyphs on it as well. So the Sumerians are credited with creating the first language, or written language, script, shall I say, which is cuneiform, but they also used hieroglyphs before that as well. So the Sumerians were writing in with two different scripts. So this bowl right here it's got Sumerian writing on it, 2 types. And it just can't be there. Mainstream archaeologists would say, no, the Sumerians didn't come to Peru in the Andes, and there's no writing there. Supposedly the people didn't have writing. So this is an OOPArt, an out-of-place artifact, an impossible artifact. It's literally a time bomb for archaeology, and all that archaeologists can really do is ignore it. And that's what they do. Only Ancient Aliens has ever had this bowl on a documentary that I know of. And I was there at the time. And even National Geographic has not really touched this because it totally overthrows all of mainstream archaeology. Just this one artifact. And in fact, basically, if this is, mainstream archaeologists would have to say this is a fake. It has to be a fake. But it's in the museum. It's in the Gold Museum in La Paz, the National Museum. And it's not the only artifact with Sumerian writing. There's another artifact that also came from that pyramid. And it's called the Pocatilla statue. And it's about a 3-foot-high granite statue. It's been broken, so it's in 2 pieces now. The guy's wearing a turban up here, and on his thigh is Sumerian hieroglyphs are written on both sides of his thigh. This is not on display. It's at that same museum where the Fuente Magna Bowl is, but this is not, you cannot see this. I've seen it because during the Ancient Aliens episode, they brought it out for that show. So here we have Sumerian writing, which is essentially indicating that Tiwanaku and Pumapunku and many of these things were somehow built by the Sumerians, or at least they were there at the time. And this takes us to the Anunnaki and the Sumerian gods and things like that, and we'll get into that more later. Here's some of the H blocks that are there. They're so famous, and they are like Lego blocks that are fitted together. You've seen that on Ancient Aliens probably. You would need like a computer CAD program to just create these blocks. They're so articulated and perfectly matched, and then they fit together into these walls. They're like prefabricated granite blocks that would be, in my mind, they're cut with power tools, with diamond tools and things like that. All right, let's jump now to some other interesting places like the Serapeum. This is my friend Christopher Dunn, who wrote the Giza power plant. The Serapeum was closed for almost 20 years in Egypt. It's out in Saqqara. It's in the deserts west of the pyramids. It's underground. See, when you go into the Serapeum, you walk down, you're just seeing like flat desert out there, and then you're going down these stairs, and then you get inside the Serapeum with just all these tunnels and side tunnels. And what's in there are these gigantic basalt boxes. They weigh about 80 tons. They're perfectly made. They have lids on them. And the big question here is how they could move these around inside these tunnels. They would also have to have levitation, some kind of anti-gravity that's moving these blocks and putting them into small little closets. What mainstream archaeologists and Egyptologists would always say is that, oh, sure, all you need is, 500 guys pulling on ropes, to move these things, and that's all you need, and they'll build you a pyramid and all that. And it's all just brute power and some rollers and a lot of ropes, and actually the men have to be in harnesses, and they're all pulling these giant blocks around. I mean, mainstream archaeologists and Egyptologists, they have to explain this stuff. But it's not easy to do it. I mean, you just calculate, well, you get 600 guys pulling on this block, and you'll move it. But the problem is, in tight spaces like the Serapeum, there's no place for them to stand. You can't have those guys. I mean, only a few people can be in there moving these blocks. So that's part of the thing. This is how they would make these things, is they can't really figure out. They'd have to drill them out with power tools. They're basalt. Basalt is extremely hard stones. Even the hieroglyphs that are etched onto some of these boxes, and there's only a few, and they're probably done at a later time, but you would need diamond-tipped drills and tools to etch these things. So we're talking power tools. One of the strange things in Egyptology is that Egyptologists say that the Egyptians didn't have iron tools or any of that. All they had were copper chisels and copper drills. And you cannot cut granite or carve into it with a copper chisel. And in fact, as I was talking to Christopher Dunn about this, and he said, yeah, what Egyptologists are literally claiming is that for some Egyptian mason with his copper chisel, he's standing there, he takes one blow with a hammer on a copper chisel, and it can't be used again. And he has to hand it to the other guy, he hands him another copper chisel, and he makes another blow. I mean, you'd have to have 100 guys standing there with 100 copper chisels, handing you one for every blow you made. It's crazy. But this is, so that whoever was building these things had to have precision tools, power tools, diamond cutting tools. I mean, that's what we use today, and they could do it with no less, really. Here's Christopher Dunn again in the Serapeum. He's measuring the exactness of the straight walls. And part of it, what he's looking for is, again, he's a machinist, and just how perfect they are, which shows that basically power tools and even computer type tools are what are creating these things. So I talk about a lot of this. Chris Dunn talks about it in his books, and I talk about it in my books, Ancient Technology in Peru and Bolivia. This is another scene inside the Serapeum. All right, let's look at another oddball enigma, which is these stone balls. So stone balls around the world, the most famous ones are in Costa Rica. They're quite mysterious. Some of them are almost the size of a Volkswagen. You see a lot of them in San Jose in the main part, but the main capital. They're perfect. They're granite. I've had stonemasons and machinists tell me that making a perfectly round stone ball is one of the most difficult things to do, and that too requires computer-aided programs to cut the ball into perfect spheres. Not all stone balls are perfect spheres, but many of them are. And what were they for? Well, maybe this is probably not what stone balls were used for, plugging them up. But we don't know really what they were used for exactly. Were they used to move some of the giant megaliths? They're very mysterious. So here's some of the stone balls. They're generally, in Costa Rica, they're found in the jungles. They're just found in these mountain jungles. And it's as if really a tidal wave washed them up into the hills of southwestern Costa Rica, and kind of near to Panama on the Pacific coast. This is one. Occasionally the smaller balls will be found in graves of what they call the chiefs. So the only explanation that mainstream archaeologists could come up with in Costa Rica was that, well, the stone balls were a symbol of the king or the chief. And then they would bury the chief with a small stone ball because that was his power ball, right? Now, what's kind of strange is that Costa Rica is not the only place with these stone balls. And I was sent this by somebody in Los Angeles. It was a booklet. And it's from like 1912 or something. And it's all about building this electric trolley in Santa Monica in Los Angeles. And it's not there anymore, but it was an electric trolley that went from Santa Monica into Los Angeles. And it was on rails and stuff. And an electric trolley like that, it couldn't go over these hills and stuff that were in Los Angeles at the time, so it has to be a fairly level track for the trolley to go on. So they brought in this steam shovel to take out this hill in Los Angeles, and what did they find? A bunch of stone balls. At the time, they called them dinosaur eggs. We don't know what happened to these. They all disappeared. They're in people's gardens and backyards and wherever. We don't know what happened to them. But they're not dinosaur eggs. They're stone balls. Yeah, marbles of the gods. What's that? One of Eric von Daniken's books, I think. So here we go. Now, get this. Franz Josef Land is up near Spitsbergen. It's actually in the Russian Arctic and stuff. You can only really go up there on some cruise ship or something like that. And you get up there to Franz Josef Land, and there's a bunch of stone balls. And some of them are like just perfect granite balls, just like the ones in Costa Rica. Now, in Costa Rica, they say they're artificial. No one questions the idea that they're somehow natural. They admit these things are man-made, and whatnot. But the ones here, they're like, well, they're somehow natural. The idea was that a volcano is spewing out hot lava, and it's spinning through the air, and then it becomes a ball, and it cools off, and then falls out. So here we go. This is some of the stone balls at Franz Josef Land. These stone balls are in Bosnia. They're out, and there's this weird kind of river creek, and it's got a bunch of stone balls in it, and you can go out and see them. There's a place in Mexico that also has a bunch of stone balls. They claim that it's also somehow natural, that volcanoes are kind of creating these. Here's a place in Siberia where they were building some new city up there. They found a bunch of stone balls there. Here's some more of them. There's the Moraki boulders in New Zealand. They're on the west coast of the South Island, a popular tourist spot. They're just kind of in the water. said to be natural too. We don't know what they're doing there. So there's a whole bunch of them. There's a shot of them. They're all just kind of in the water right along the coast. There's stone balls in Italy, and they're big. I mean, and when you see stone balls like in Europe, you might think, oh, well, the catapults or something. We're like, firing these stone balls, but they're actually like too big for that. So once again, we're not really sure like what these are about, why they're there, what the purpose of them was. Here's another place, Gongxi in Hunan, China. All right, is this town, and tourists go there to see the stone balls. Here we are, more of the Chinese stone balls. Stone balls on Malta, they found there. So if you make a trip to Malta, you'll also see these stone balls. There, they know they're man-made, and they thought maybe, well, this is how they moved the giant blocks, putting them on these giant stone ball bearings, and that's a possibility. When you go to Easter Island, when you go to the museum there's a stone ball. And in fact, on Easter Island, the islanders themselves say that the most sacred thing on the whole island is this stone ball. They call Easter Island, the islanders, they said, well, we're the center of the earth. We're the navel of the earth. And Cusco is called that too. And Delphi in Greece as well. But what is the center, the power spot of Easter Island is, and this is on kind of near the north coast of Easter Island, is this small little enclosure that has one large stone ball and 4 smaller stone balls around it. And the Easter Islanders say, this is the most important thing on the island. And archaeologists say, well, why? And they can't give an answer. They say, well, we don't know, but this is it. This thing is the most important thing. On Easter Island is an amazing place, and Easter Island is a triangle of 3 volcanoes with another volcano sort of in the middle, and that volcano is the quarry. And there's hundreds of these statues that are there in the quarry. Many of them are buried. They've been quarried, moved only maybe a few hundred yards. They're sitting there on Easter Island. The quarry is here, but what they did later was they moved some of the statues around the edge of the island. And so they would move them from the quarry to these areas, and the statues that were moved from the quarry to the shore, they all faced inland. And the Easter Islanders early on said, they said that, yeah, there was a power in their eyes called mana, and that the eyes of the statues protected the island and kept it from sinking. That's what they said, because the Easter Islanders said, we're from this lost land called Hiva that's out in the Pacific, like the Lost Continent of Mu or something, and that's gone. It's under the water, but Easter Island is still above the water, but we need these statues to protect the island, keep us from sinking. So back at the quarry, these statues are leaning over. They have the big long ears, by the way, which is something you see in India and Southeast Asia. Buddha and Shiva, they always have very long earlobes. That's what we have on Easter Island. You also have them inside the crater. I mean, it's quite strange. And some of the statues are gigantically huge. They're massive. And exactly why they would build all these statues, how they would move them around. And this is what people didn't get. They're buried in some cases. Up to 40 feet of dirt and detritus is burying these statues. So, but mainstream archaeologists are saying, oh, they're only 400 or 500 years old, 600 years old or something. But how would that much soil build up around these statues? I mean, they weren't purposely buried, we don't think. I mean, that is really something, how huge these statues are. And it would show that they're really, really old. And it shows, too, that some kind of cataclysm hit the island and just wiped it out, buried a lot of these statues. Then later other people came. So you can see just how huge these things are and all the dirt around them. It's baffling. This is in the museum there. The statues that came alive, they thought the statues were alive. They had this inlaid like whale ivory and obsidian in their eyes, a power called mana, which is a Sanskrit word too, an energy, an occult energy came out of the eyes and protected the island. This is also in the museum there at Easter Island. This is the only statue of a woman, apparently. She has breasts, but very strange statue with this elongated head. I mean, it looks like an alien. This is a unique statue there, very strange. There's also another unique statue that was found in 1960. It wasn't put on display until really just about 10 or 12 years ago. And it's something of an alien-looking statue. It doesn't have an elongated head. Looks kind of like a gray alien. This, too, is a very unusual, unique statue there. Also on Easter Island is this place called Vinapu. It has the perfectly cut stones, cut by power tools, just like the walls in Peru and Bolivia and elsewhere. So once again, we're seeing the perfect megalithic type construction there. Perfect corners, little small key kind of stones to lock them all in. So when you see that and you're familiar with the work in Peru, you see it's identical. Thor Heyerdahl, the famous Norwegian archaeologist explorer, he discovered this statue, which is kneeling. And this is a unique statue too on the island. He's kneeling. He's not standing up. And this is what's known as a quizuo posture. It's a special kneeling posture. So when you're kneeling and you're on your knees and usually you put your hands on your thighs, just like this statue. That's known as quizuo. And that too is seen around the world, this posture. It's basically, here's an Egyptian statue in the quizuo position. It's a supplicant posture. You're in front of the king, and you're on your knees, and oftentimes you put your head forward, and if the king or the queen likes you, they knight you by putting a sword on your shoulder or something, and if they don't like you, they cut your head off, you know. So that's the quizuo posture. So we see it on Easter Island, we see it in China, we see it in Tiwanaku. These were statues at Tiwanaku. They're in the quizuo posture, on their knees with the hands there. Here's an Olmec statue in Mexico. He's in the quizuo posture too. This is from the Indus Valley culture today in Pakistan and Western India. He's in the quizuo posture. This is a special kind of a posture. Also on Easter Island, there's a type of writing there called rongo writing. And that writing features people, stick figures with their hands and their legs, and also even their hands and figures are in certain positions, much like sailors use flags and stuff like that on ships. And that same writing is found in the Indus Valley in ancient India. And it's also very similar to Shang dynasty glyphs too from ancient China. This is the rongo tablet. So mainstream archaeologists again are saying, oh, the Easter Islanders they just invented their own language, their own script, which in South America they supposedly never did. And what they say is that it's written in what's called Bostophedan pattern or as the oxbloud. So you read one line left to right, and then the next line, right to left to right, right to left. Certain languages were written this way, left to right to left. Doric Greek was written that way. Hittite languages were written that way. We can't read rongo writing or the Indus Valley script. We don't know what any of this says. Another island that's really the eighth wonder of the world is an island in Micronesia called Ponape. And on Ponape is this massive city called Nan Madol. Nan Madol is 100 artificial islands. Walls are 30 to 40 feet high. It's built out of basalt. Archaeologists estimate that there's 250 million tons of basalt in this city. It's built into the ocean. According to the islanders, the stones flew through the air from the other side of the island. And this is what they say. And they say two brothers came who had flying dragons. They flew all this basalt material across the island and stacked it up into walls. 100 artificial islands. And much of it's underwater even. I mean, let me say that again. 250 million tons of basalt are in the city. Entire mountains would be dismantled to get all the material. They don't know where it came from. It's that baffling. You have underwater ruins. You've got, there's literally millions of tons of basalt underwater, and then you have these artificial walls up above. This thing is the 8th wonder of the world. But again, mainstream archaeologists are saying, oh, the islanders just built it 1,000 years ago. They put these giant basalt logs onto their canoes, floated them there. And the islanders are saying, oh, no, we didn't do that. No, they flew through the air. You know, it was magic. And the archaeologists are, oh, no, that's not what you did. This is one of the volcanic plugs that is on the other side of the island. And it still exists. It's where some of the basalt could have come from. And they call this Chicken Shit Mountain, actually. But the whole thing is that entire mountains like this would have been dismantled to create all of this material. So who's doing it? The coneheads, right? And I know that Brian was telling me too that how they've just gone some DNA results on some of these Paracas skulls. I first got there in 1984 and started seeing these skulls. I was like, wow, this is something. And some of these skulls too, I mean, they're twice as long as a normal human skull. They're found at Tiwanaku. Some of these guys look pretty weird. And these elongated skulls. In Paracas and other areas along the coast of Peru, it's extremely dry. So skeletal material lasts for a long time. We have x-rays. I've been there with Brian too a couple of times. This is an unusual skull that Brian actually showed me. And we know that ancient people did do this head binding. And in fact, they did it up in Montana at Flathead Lake. Flathead Lake in Montana is called Flathead Lake because the Flathead Indians live there. And the Flathead Indians were called the Flathead Indians because they did this too. They smashed these skulls, they made cone heads. The Chinook Indians in Seattle did that too. We have the Olmecs, the Mayans did it. This is an unusual skull because normally you're going to have the plates in your head. As you become older, they are loose when you're younger, but eventually they fuse as you become an adult. But this skull doesn't have the fusing of the plates of the head. So here we have a cone head without the fusing of the plates, and that might indicate that this is not a human skull, not a normal human skull, and that this would be of the Anunnaki, and the idea there is that some people, some ancient races, apparently naturally had these elongated heads. The Anunnaki, other people, perhaps some Egyptians, but we know that other people imitated this right up until modern times. On the island of Vanuatu and the Kurds and other people, they were still doing this. Akhenaten and Nefertiti, the Egyptians were doing it too. This is Meritaten, one of the daughters of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, and she's a conehead too, with this elongated skull. Tutankhamun, you don't hear this about him much, but he's a conehead as well, and he has an elongated skull too. So here's one of the Sumerian Ubaid statues. They have elongated heads. We really only know them really from the statues and figurines, and much the same with the Olmecs as well. And they have what they call the coffee bean eyes. That's what archaeologists call this, coffee bean eyes. So they have the cone heads. In theory, these are depictions of the Anunnaki kind of people from Sumeria. But again, we find these cone heads and elongated heads literally all over the world, and even on Pacific Islands and things. With Sumerian cylinder seals and stuff like that, we have pictures of gods and Sumerians on a flying disc here, as they're depicted, and they're worshiping and whatnot. Here's another Sumerian seal, one of the winged angels, kind of birdman angel things. The whole idea of angels and gods having wings, we find that in Sumeria a lot. And the Sumerian gods, the Anunnaki, these are gods. You know them from the conical hats they're wearing that have these little spikes. And that indicates that they're one of the gods, the Anunnaki. And you would think they have these cone heads and stuff. All right, let's jump forward now just to a little bit of UFO activity. Part of the whole thing with UFOs and craft, these elongated craft, they're not just spaceships and aircraft, they're submarines too. They can fly into space, they can go to the moon, and they're submarines. They can come out of the water. These, what you're going to see now, are photos from March of 1971. They were taken by the USS submarine called the Trepang in the North Atlantic. It's up near Iceland and Greenland. And these photos were leaked only about 6 years ago to a French magazine in Paris, and they were published. So somebody who was on that submarine or in the US military leaked these photos to this French magazine. And probably most of you are going to be seeing them for the first time. So it was a submarine with a periscope and stuff was taking these photos through the periscope. So the first thing that was happening was this craft is coming up out of the water. Then it comes up out of the water. You can see it here. It's the second photo. Water's coming off of it. And it's coming up. Here it is. Now it's out of the water. And it's leveling out over the ocean. The submarine's taking the photos. It's still got water coming off it and almost like steam and stuff like that. Here's another photo. It apparently had lights along the side. This thing is huge. It looks like one of the classic cigar-shaped kind of craft. Here it would be now leveled out. All the water's gone from it. It's just hovering over the ocean right now. Here's really what is apparently the last of the photos of that craft, a huge sort of mothership submarine type craft. It looks a lot like a submarine, but this is actually a submarine and a spaceship. Right after this huge cigar-shaped shift came out of the water, a second craft then came out after it. And it was a smaller craft that was something of a saucer-shaped or triangular-shaped craft. And here's the last picture of it. So apparently there were two craft coming up out of the water in 1971. So this was taken in the North Atlantic. But these are pretty astonishing photos, and in my mind, completely authentic. So we're not sure what we're looking at. We're looking at UFOs and USOs. Unidentified submersible objects. So this is all pretty unusual, to say the least. Here's another, this is quite recent, May of 2016. And this is right over Dayton, Ohio, which is where Wright-Patterson Air Force Base is. And they looked up in the sky, it's broad daylight, and here's this weird kind of arrow-type craft just hovering in the sky. It's like on in the afternoon. So this is a picture of it. And it was just hovering there. And then it finally just moved up into a cloud and then was gone. So unusual kind of thing. And it's strange that it's also near basically an Air Force base where that was happening. This is what's called the Baltic Sea anomaly. And it was this craft that was found on the bottom of the Baltic Sea up near Sweden and Finland and whatnot. And here's an image of it, what it looks like. And what's interesting about this thing, it looks like the Millennium Falcon from Star Wars. So how about that? And we all love Star Wars. So, all right, let's talk a little bit about Nikola Tesla here. How am I doing? Okay, all right. So Tesla, one of my heroes. We all hear about how Otis invented the elevator. Yes, I've got my Tesla shirt on. Yay. Tesla is really a suppressed scientist. I grew up, I was a good student and interested in science, but I did not learn about Nikola Tesla. I learned that Otis invented the elevator, and I learned about Edison and all that kind of stuff. But you don't really learn about Tesla much unless you become an electrical engineer. Although Tesla now, fortunately, has become popular, as he should be. But ultimately, he was, after World War II, knowledge of him, he was suppressed. He was even airbrushed out of photos. Group photos with Einstein and other scientists, they literally airbrushed Tesla out in some, just because they didn't want people to know about Tesla that much. Because Tesla invented things 100 years ago that are still science fiction today. Tesla died during World War II, by the way. Here's Tesla's laboratory around 1900. There's Mark Twain, and Tesla's in the background at Tesla's laboratory. Tesla invented the electricity that we use today, alternating current. It's what's lighting this hotel, it's what's lighting the whole world. A lot of people don't understand that alternating current, AC electricity, is created by rotating magnetic fields. That's what's creating all this power. And you have a small Tesla three-phase engine in your car, your alternator, that's creating power and stuff like that. So that's how simple and genius the three-phase power is that we have today. And Tesla was a visionary. He envisioned these inventions in the sky. A lot of people think that Tesla was a reincarnated Atlantean engineer or something, and he was just bringing this ancient technology, and it's a simple technology, alternating current and power. Extraterrestrials must have it. They probably had it in Atlantis. So the idea that power, electrical power as we know it, we've only had for 120 years or so. But that's, the same power, the Egyptians had it, ancient people had it, the Atlanteans had it. Marconi is another person. I'd like to mention him just briefly. He was Tesla's student. He was a genius as well. A lot of people who are big fans of Tesla don't like Marconi because they think that Marconi stole some of Tesla's ideas, including the radio. And Marconi is sometimes credited with inventing the radio, but it really was Tesla. And now Tesla gets that credit really now. Marconi was a genius. And the difference between Tesla and Marconi was Tesla was a social misfit. He was a terrible businessman. He couldn't run a business. He just didn't understand money and things like that. He was very much a loner. He never got married or dated. He had a lot of phobias. I mean, he was kind of a strange guy. Marconi was quite different. Marconi was a good businessman. He was a very socially adept person. He became a multi-millionaire. He developed big companies. Some people believe that Marconi faked his death in 1937 and moved with 100 scientists from Europe right before World War II and moved to South America and created a secret city there, like a James Bond Moonraker type city. And in fact, the James Bond movie, Moonraker, is mimicking this secret city that Marconi supposedly developed. So here's our other great genius, Albert Einstein. Albert, after the theory of relativity, also around the same time of the 20s, Einstein proposed the unified field. The unified field was the field that gravity and magnetism and electricity and what they also call the weak force, according to Einstein, all of these forces emanated from the unified field. That's what Einstein thought. And Einstein was supposed to write a big paper and a big equation. And the idea is that there are equations for electromagnetism. But with the unified field, you would have an equation for electrogravity and magnetogravity. And all these things are manifesting from the unified field. And this is gravity control, gravity, anti-gravity, all that kind of stuff. And this is what you would need for in theory, your flying saucer. You're going to have plasmas. Mercury can be part of it, gyros. They're electric. So that's part of the whole idea, really, with UFOs, flying saucers, and things like that. They're electric. They're not jets. They're not rockets. There's an electric power there that's powering them. You need power. You need electricity. Tesla also is the famous inventor of the death rays. And they're still a mystery, too. Back in the 20s and 30s, that was big talk, death rays and stuff like that. And one idea of Tesla's death ray was a scalar wave type weapon where these energy bottles and energy waves converge. Here they converge, and where these waves, energies converge, things are obliterated. And that's your death ray. It's only been recent that a different kind of death ray came out from Princeton, published a book just a couple of years ago about Tesla. And it was the first time that these diagrams, because Tesla never patented it, and this death ray was a plasma jet of mercury. So this death ray would spew out pellets, bursts of mercury that were electrified. And this would be like the ray guns on Star Wars, even in a sense, the lightsabers and things like that. So mercury is part of it. By the way, when you go to Area 51 near Las Vegas, if you drive out there, you can drive along the highway, and there's even a sign, the secret city. I mean, you need to have a classified pass to get in there. The name of it is Mercury. That's the name of the city in Area 51. So one of the things that Tesla was doing too were these towers. And the Wardenclyffe Tower, what Tesla wanted to do in the end was broadcast power, electricity, just like radio and TV. And what we have now is Wi-Fi sort of things too. Tesla patented this tower, and what it was going to do was it was going to broadcast power into the atmosphere. He went to Colorado Springs first to do his early experiments, where he built a tower that would then broadcast the power. And then he patented this device, this tower, and he began building it in Long Island. With Tesla, these towers would put out power into the atmosphere, and anti-gravity ships that were electric would draw power from these towers. These ships have no wings. They're anti-gravity. They're electric. And that was part of the whole idea with Tesla's power system. This is in the 1920s. That if you had a lamp, say, you would just put a lamp on a table, but you wouldn't need an outlet. You would just put it on a table, and then you could turn it on. And it would take power from the power that was being put in the atmosphere, just like television and radio and stuff like that. And so here again, in the 1920s, the magazines and TV and whatnot, they were all these old serials. They're using Tesla technology. They have these, Flash Gordon buzzing airships, all that kind of stuff. And they're drawing these they have these powerful searchlights and things like that on them. Very similar to modern day UFO stuff. Here's Tesla's tower down here. It's putting out these power. There's this battles is occurring. These airships that are also elongated type cigar-shaped ship. This is all what Tesla imagined. What stopped this was J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan was funding the building of these towers. And Tesla needed funding. This was part of the problem. He was a terrible businessman. He couldn't ever save any money for himself. He was constantly broke. But when J.P. Morgan discovered that Tesla was essentially giving free energy to the world, and that all he could do if he was funding this was be a lamp manufacturer, he didn't like that. And he was like, well, how can I make money off this? You know, I can't meter this power. And he put the kibosh on it. He said, okay, that's it. We're not funding this anymore. And ultimately, the FBI came and tore that tower down. Like, this was 1923. So, but Tesla was still famous of that time. And every year on his birthday, Tesla would give the reporters in New York would come to him and ask him about death rays and towers and new inventions and whatever. Tesla died in 1943 during World War II. So now, let's get back to Atlantis. According to a group out of San Diego, they started it in Chicago actually, and they were called the Lemurian Fellowship. And they claimed that in Atlantis were also these towers called the Max Towers. And the Max Towers were these crystal towers that were also broadcasting power into the atmosphere. This is what they said. And they published a couple of books. One was called A Dweller on Two Planets, and then a second book called An Earth Dweller Returns. And in those books, they talk about these towers. Well, there are crystal towers like this, and we call them obelisks. An obelisk is a monolithic granite tower. It has to be monolithic, one single solid piece of stone. And it's granite, and granite is infused with tiny quartz crystals. And there's different kinds of granite, and in fact, the way they categorize granite is through the crystal content and how big the quartz crystals are in the granite. The smaller the crystals, and it's a different kind of granite, the larger the crystals it is. The Egyptians most of their obelisks were Aswan granite, red granite, which is a really high crystal content granite. So here, with obelisks, are these same crystal towers, apparently, that the Lemurian Fellowship was talking about. Now, one of the things with obelisks is that Egyptologists have no explanation for them. They don't know why. Egyptians would quarry obelisks. Typical obelisk is about 500 tons. Just quarrying it and lifting it out of a quarry is tough enough. But to move it to someplace and to erect it, make it stand up, these are very difficult. This is the unfinished obelisk before it was uncovered, completely uncovered. This is in Aswan, so this is like 1880 or something like that. Here's the unfinished obelisk today. I was telling you earlier how they stopped construction on it and the quarrying because they found that it had a flaw underneath it, a crack, and it wasn't going to be perfect, so they couldn't use it. And this obelisk would have weighed about 1,000 tons. So it's an amazing, it's something. Here's my friend Christopher Dunn standing in the channel. He maintains, too, that they're using power tools and even heavy equipment to quarry it and cut it. And the whole idea, too, is that these, and I was there in Egypt with John Anthony West one time, and he had a tuning fork, and he was showing us how these obelisks are tuned and they're cut, there's a certain, there's special antennas. And in fact, at the very least, obelisks are giant acupuncture needles for the earth, at the least. And Egyptologists have no explanation. They maintain that an obelisk symbolizes a ray of the sun. That's their explanation. There's very few books ever written on obelisks because Egyptologists don't know what to say. There's maybe 4 books ever written about obelisks, and I wrote one of them. Here's the Washington Monument being struck by lightning, just as a kind of an example. The Washington Monument is a faux obelisk. It's not a real obelisk because it's not monolithic. It's built with lots of different blocks. You can go inside it and all that. But it's interesting that the Masons, and even today, it symbolizes, the Washington Monument symbolizes the power of Washington, D.C., and of America and the military. So, but obelisks aren't just in Egypt, by the way. Obelisks are also in Ethiopia, in Aksum. Here's some of the obelisks in Aksum. They're mysterious too. They're megalithic. And in fact, the largest obelisk that was ever erected, they say, was not in Egypt, but it was in Ethiopia. And it's this one right here. It fell. It was so huge. As it fell, it crashed down on this other giant megalithic structure, destroyed it, broke into like 10 pieces, this huge obelisk in Aksum. And just pieces of this obelisk are massively huge, weighing hundreds of tons. It's really something. And this other structure that's this is part of the broken obelisk here, and it was something else. It wasn't an obelisk, but also giant blocks, and now the broken pieces of the obelisk on top of it. But even the Lonely Planet guidebook to Aksum was saying in it that the people in Aksum believe that underneath this rubble here is an anti-gravity machine that erected all the obelisks and even cut the stones. And today, and this was in Graham Hancock's great book, Sign and the Seal, where he's asking some of these priests in Aksum, he said, well, how did you guys raise these obelisks and make all this stuff? And the priest tells him, oh, the Ark of the Covenant did it. That's their explanation. Here's also megalithic tombs in Aksum, and you have the keystone cuts here too that we were looking at. Here's one of them. So here's one of those the same keystone cuts that we're seeing in Ollantaytambo in Peru, at Tiwanaku and Pumapunku in Bolivia, also in Vietnam, they're in Borobudur in Java. So we have the same stuff there in Ethiopia. And even in Ethiopia, they're cutting these monolithic doors where they take a solid piece of granite and then cut a door in it. Who does that? You see that also at Tiwanaku. And speaking of the Ark of the Covenant, this church, this small church here, Ethiopians believe the Ark of the Covenant is inside that church right today. And that it's protected by a priest who is, one priest is in there to guard it. No one can go in, not even the king of Ethiopia or the president. No one is allowed into that building except for this one priest. And before he dies, he selects another priest to take his place. So Ethiopians think the Ark of the Covenant is in there. Obelisks are also in Europe. These are the Devil's Arrows in Yorkshire, in England. And they're obelisks. There's like 4 of them. They're just near York. This is another obelisk that's called a Rudston monolith. It's an obelisk at a small church out in eastern Yorkshire near Scarborough. It's a small little church, but there's this obelisk that's standing there. There's part of it, they've put a little tin cover on it. And strangely, now during the 1970s, when Charles Berlitz wrote The Bermuda Triangle, which is a very popular book, I mean, after Eric von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods, The Bermuda Triangle by Charles Berlitz was probably the second best-selling book of that period, all those kind of books. Well, a number of other books came out around that time because Charles Berlitz's Bermuda Triangle book was so popular. So a couple of books came out about the Great Lakes Triangle and all the ships and planes that disappear around the Great Lakes. So Hugh Cochrane wrote this book about 1980. He's Canadian. This is not a very well-known book in the United States. Most copies were published in Britain. So it was called Gateway to Oblivion, the Great Lakes Vortex. Now, one of the chapters in this book is talking about a place just in Canada on the northern part of Lake Ontario, near a place called Presqu'île Provincial Park, right here. So around the year 1800, as Cochrane is talking about this Île Presqu'île Park, what happened was, get this, people would row out a couple of hundred yards out into the lake and the tip of an obelisk was coming up out of the lake. This is what Hugh Cochran says. And the lake was clear, and they could look down, and they could see for a couple of 100 feet this obelisk in the water, standing there. And just the very tip of the obelisk was above the lake. And people, according to Hugh Cochran, people on a nice day, summer day, they would row out to the tip of this obelisk, and they would tie their boats to the obelisk and have a little picnic and stuff, and then go back to shore and stuff. But what happened then was that there was a ship that was there. It was a big storm, and they were taking a prisoner who was a Native American prisoner who had murdered somebody, and they were bringing him from one place, and they were bringing him to this area. But a big storm came up, and the people on the shore, they knew that this ship was coming, that it was nighttime now, but it was a terrible, terrible storm. And the people on the shore then, they lit big bonfires to try and show the ship where the shore was and kind of act as just a primitive lighthouse. What happened was that ship apparently struck the obelisk and sank. All lives were lost. And after that, the obelisk was gone. So that obelisk is not there anymore after that storm and that ship hitting it. So after about 1805 or 1810, that obelisk was gone. So how about that? I mean, that's quite strange that there would be an obelisk there. There was supposedly an obelisk at Pumapunku as well, there in Bolivia. All right, now we're going to go to the moon. So let's go to the moon and the strange things on the moon. There are obelisks on the moon. They're called the Blair Cuspids. They were first found by American probes. This was about 1966. So they were going around the moon. And what they did was they took this photo, and Blair was an engineer who was working for Boeing. And he noticed, and then the Russians put this out, but they call them now cuspids, so the Blair Cuspids. This is what they look like. They're apparently a bunch of obelisks that are on the moon. So how about that? So we have obelisks around the world, and now we have even obelisks on the moon, which is pretty strange. The moon itself some people think the moon is hollow. When the Apollo 11, when the command module actually, it crashed onto the moon, and NASA said that the moon rang like a bell for several minutes, and the idea that it was hollow. Some researchers say that there are certain craters on the moon that they can't find a bottom to, and that they're literally entrances into the hollow moon. In some ways, our moon is like a Death Star or something from Star Wars. And some people think that our moon is artificial. Now, the Russians also had their programs, and the Russians, because of the Soviet official thing of atheism, and they were trying to suppress religions in the Soviet Union, and the Russians were very open to space visitors, UFOs, structures on the moon, very scientific about the whole thing. And so the Russian space program was quite different than the American space program. They would release unusual photos of the moon, including this one, the Zond 3 photo. And it's showing what is apparently a 20-mile-high tower on the moon. And here's another picture of it. And Mike Barra also put this in his book, Ancient Aliens on the Moon. So here we have also what are these giant towers on the moon, it would seem, like obelisks. There are also structures on the moon, too, that look like ziggurats and things like that. The idea is that NASA is familiar with that there are structures on the moon, but they don't want to talk about it. The Russians do. The Russians will talk about these things. Craft on the moon. Even there's other Apollo missions. The idea that we're already back on the moon and that we have bases on the moon, even possibly joint American-Russian bases on the moon. This is another, what appears to be some kind of obelisk or pyramid on the moon. And with like the Blair cuspids and things like that, it's these shadows. Looking at the shadows that come from these objects are part of what we can see. These are some other Russian photos of the moon. They apparently show also towers or what seem like Tesla type objects and energy towers and things like that. And now let's go briefly to Mars, where also there's some strange stuff. Mars has two moons. One is called Phobos, the other is called Deimos. And they rotate in opposite directions around Mars. And they're quite small moons. They're not, our moon is very, very large compared to these moons. And early on, it was suggested that the moons of Mars were artificial. And in fact, you have on Phobos, you have these weird striations and things like that. And there's a monolith on one of the moons, on Phobos. So here, as you can see from the shadow there, it's some tall obelisk kind of structure that's on Phobos. So this is what the computer, what they think it might be, but it's this giant, weird tower that's up there. And again, so we don't know exactly that. Here's the other moon of Mars, which is Deimos. And in fact, in 1989, the Russians, just right before as the Soviet Union was dissolving, and this Marina Popovich she was a Russian astronaut, and the Russians sent a probe to Mars called the Phobos probe. And the probe took this photo of Phobos as it approached Mars, and it appears to be what is this very large, elongated craft coming up to the moon here. And so the Russian Phobos probe is taking a photo of the moon of Phobos, and here's this craft is coming up. Here's another one of the photos here. So the Russians eventually released these photos, she did, and then finally the probe turned towards Mars, the actual planet Mars, and something was coming from the planet towards the probe, and it took this photo. It was like a shot or some energy or a craft or a missile, and it took this last photo, and then the Soviet Phobos probe went out, and that was it. And it was basically shot out of orbit. So on Mars, unusual mechanical parts and things on Mars. Here's what they call the D&M pyramid on Mars. Of course, you probably have all heard about the face on Mars. Supposedly the Sphinx on Mars with the pyramid in the background. Other what it would appear to be structures on Mars. And this is what they call the Mars monolith. Also would seem to be something like an obelisk, or and in many ways this is like the monolith that was in the movie and the book 2001, A Space Odyssey, where in that movie and the book they go to the moon and they find a monolith like this, and then that monolith sends them on to Jupiter. So one last thing here, just to finish it all up, about our solar system. So back in the mid-1800s, there was a German mathematician named Bode, and he created what's called Bode's law. Bode's law is a logarithmic mathematical formula that as you go out from the sun, you're going to have planets, Mercury and then Venus and then Earth and then Mars. And in Bode's law, between Mars and Jupiter, there was another planet in Bode's law, and then you would have Saturn and other giants. Well, what astronomers found was that Bode's law fit our solar system almost perfectly, except for the asteroid belt. And essentially, what Bode was saying, oh, there should be a planet here. But there's not a planet. There's all these rocks in space instead. And so what the asteroid belt is apparently is an exploded planet. There should be a planet there, but that planet exploded, and we have all these rocks in space. This is the largest body in the asteroid belt. It's called Ceres, and it has this weird bright spot on it. And NASA can't really figure this out. I mean, it's almost like it's being lit from inside or something like that. How about that? So that's part of the whole thing of the idea of the asteroid belt. But now we get to Saturn, and the Saturn satellites and the ring structure, and this moon of Iapetus of Saturn. Just go through it. It has this kind of navel. It looks like it's an artificial kind of thing. And it has this seam that's running along it right here. So we have this seam. It's quite unusual. And yeah, other people have pointed this out, how this ridge goes through. It's almost like it's an artificial moon. And the idea is that our moon is artificial too. NASA once said that our moon is older than the Earth. And they surmised that somehow our moon and some of these other moons, they were brought here from other solar systems. How about that? So there's a lot of mysteries out in the universe and a lot to discover. So keep watching Ancient Aliens. All right, thank you, everybody. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming.